So let's open it up to some Q&A. We got a good 5 minutes. And again, I'll stay on if folks want to stay on for a little bit. We'll keep it recording and I'll just keep going until Catherine's got to go. So Catherine, what do you got?
Oh my goodness, we have several questions. You can all hear me good, right? Can you hear me, Kathy?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, good. So we have some tremendous feedback here, Kathy. Lots and lots of thank yous. All right, so let's go down the list. I am currently applying to higher ed programs. Do you feel as if racism is still an issue within institutions? This was a question asked earlier on, so you may have sort of, addressed this during the rest of the conversation, but I'm just kind of going through the list and reading them. Also, my life goal would be implementing a diversity class into general required curriculum. Do you think this is an attainable goal?
Yes, many things are happening, and you might have Googled, but I would Google it again. I want to say UMass Amherst, but if people can in the chat put in, do you have in general required ed classes, equity inclusion woven in? Just type in the school and maybe if you're willing, your name and email so they can contact you. Or if the person who wrote this doesn't mind right now putting your email and people can maybe send you stuff. Every organization in higher ed I've ever gone to and every K-12, institutional racism has been embedded into the way we do it. I'm finding, particularly the last couple of years, more and more national organizations are challenging and questioning, and folks like Dr. Sean Harper just moved to University of Southern California, USC. The Penn group, or at least he had one at Race Center at Penn, now starting one at USC. More and more workshops challenging faculty, challenging administrators. He also does a lot of consulting. But there are more and more people that are doing work at the organizational level in higher ed. And we have a long way to go. So a couple quick hopes for you. And I don't know your racial identity, but I would start early asking questions like, can you show me what courses have embedded in them an attention to looking at issues of equity, inclusion, social justice, so I have the capacity and skills when I finish this program to be an effective higher ed change agent? And which ones particularly are focused? And are there any across campus that in my electives I could take? And then when you meet some faculty, you say, who else do you know? So if you meet somebody that you're like, I want to learn with them, ask them who else they know, because I'll bet it's still a pretty small, connected group that if it were me doing it again, I was lucky. I was in a social justice program at UMass Amherst. But if I were to do it again, I was not very aware of that. I would ask these questions because there were people on campus I needed to have studied with in other departments that would have had me be much more effective in my work. What else you got?
Okay, this is a very brief question, is what are the alternative, quote unquote, non-white behaviors?
So what I love about Tema Okun, OKUN's work, is she has anecdotes. I forgot to mention. So everything around urgency, say, and again, I don't remember what hers are, but things like you're in a meeting and folks like, we don't have time to ask our clients what they want or to ask people throughout the organization their opinion. I would today say, I can appreciate the sense of urgency. And I've been here long enough to know we have moved in urgency and we've had to redo, and it's taken more money, more time. Could we just slow down a moment and think, are there creative ways, even in a day, we each could go out, talk to 5 people. I'll write the email to ask 3 questions. I'll get some people I work with to gather the feedback, and let's meet tomorrow and consider more voices. And I want to intentionally make sure we bring in people by group membership that aren't at this table. So it takes some courage to do that, but that's an anecdote to slowing down urgency, to not having hierarchy be the right people, to not having objective, I think I'm getting several here, that we want qualitative input, and that the written word isn't, theory says, and it's like, let's get the real people's voices that'll be impacted by this decision involved in the consideration. Tema Okun, it's great stuff. What else you got?
All right, how do you create a white affinity space to discuss where biased attitudes come from without coming across as exclusionary?
Catherine, I want to send out a chapter I wrote on some white caucus work, and I forgot I had it.
Okay.
Um, what if you talk to some whites and said, are you interested in this? And then if you find some folks, you say, some of your colleagues of color say, we're thinking of doing this. I don't even know if it'd be useful to have a parallel gathering for folks of color. And I don't know if these handouts would be useful. But we're wanting to deepen our capacity as whites to recognize interracist dynamics. We're committed to this. We don't want to be exclusionary. So I don't know if having some parallel space, that's one. I actually think folks of color on campus will like, if they know you and trust you, that it's not going to be a space where you're complaining about people of color or reproducing white culture. I mean, if you say you really are committed and you share these resources, like these are the handouts we're going to use, and share my book if you want, and ask them, are there other books you want us to read? So maybe in collaboration. Mm. And when privileged group people come together, in this case, whites, at the White Privilege Conference, we have white affinity space. There's also parallel multiracial space, folks of color space, indigenous space, and other marginalized identity space. I set it up. We're working whiteness. We're working white supremacy. We're looking at our behaviors. When I've done it on campuses or other places, or even at the White Privilege Conference, that's a little plug, by the way, it's in April. Sometimes a person of color or a multiracial, biracial person will come in. I don't tell them we'll go. Hell no. I keep the content focused on whiteness. At SJTI, we have caucuses. Sometimes a person who's multiracial, biracial, and white's part of their heritage will come to the White Caucus because they want to look at how they've internalized whiteness. They sometimes stay, and sometimes they're like, okay, that was enough. I want to go now, work on how I'm experiencing marginalization. So those are a couple quick ideas. It reminded me this could be a whole webinar in itself. So I'm making some notes by your questions. So why don't we do a few more?
All right, let's see. Some of the meeting behavior you described seems like male dominant behavior as much as racist behavior. Since I have observed them in all white groups, does the intersectionality matter in how you address these behaviors?
Oh, that's a great question. Yes. And then at the individual level, people's personality, your relationship with them, there's so much context. It makes total sense that dominant privileged behaviors are similar. And if you were to put a class analysis on this, a hierarchical, how do people in privileged presidents, vice presidents react? You could have white women, you could have folks of color in senior roles that might act some of these behaviors. I find their behaviors not as offensive generally, but sometimes I'm thinking of a couple, right? Supreme Court. So yes, intersectionality is incredibly important. And a trap I fall into is kind of floundering, like, someone's transgender and they're white, but I think what they did was race-based. And so I might, if I'm walking on eggshells and floundering, I might ask a question or offer it as a possibility. I said, I could be wrong. I'd love to talk about the meeting we were just in. There was something you said that hit me a little off. I'm learning a lot about race and racism, and that's how it hit me. And it could be a whole bunch of things were going on in that moment, especially with all your intersecting identities. But I'd love to have the conversation, because as I saw you say X, I saw some folks of color kind of move back and cross their arms. I don't know what that meant, but I'd love to talk about it. I was extroverting, but those might be a few ways to acknowledge you want to talk about the race cut, and because of intersectionality, there might have been other dynamics. I know as a lesbian woman who's white, I have been triggered as a lesbian or as a woman, sometimes both, and I react out of the arrogance, like, how dare you? And then my actions are more out of the white privileged behavior. So I heard Reverend Dr. Jamie Washington first say we're sometimes triggered out of our marginalized identities. That's where a hot button is. But we react out of our privilege and entitlement, arrogance, dominating, taking up space, demanding. That's very familiar to me. Catherine, can you stay on and do a few more? Because I didn't ask if you had more time.
I can, yes. Yes, we're good.
All right.
There's some great questions here. So, all right, the next one. We have too many whites in leadership is a racist statement. So how should it be said so it isn't racist when that is the measurement from HR?
Yeah. And I moved very fast, so I want to apologize. Let me say a little bit more. The particular racist dynamic of that was using it as the reason to a white they didn't get the job. So I had that supervisor trying to keep the relationship with their employee. Like, buddy, you're really good. I wanted to hire you, but we had to hire a person of color. That's what is particularly, and you probably got that, but in case others missed that in my speed. Here's what I encourage organizations and leaders to talk about. Go back to your strategic plan. As an organization, we are committed to serving the increasingly diverse populations and clients. We recognize we don't yet have the competencies at all levels broadly to do that. We also recognize that the folks of color we hire, we are going back to over and over and asking them to do a second and third job, to be on committees and do more things. So we are doing a broad strategic initiative that's going to be years in the making to skill up everyone. We want every single person we hire to be culturally competent, particularly around issues of race and racism, because our data shows that's where the greatest pain and gap is. That's A. Now B, as we looked at our capacity, we're going to shift our training. C is, if we looked at who we have, particularly in influencer roles, we're noticing we're a very homogeneous group. So while we're working to hire and train for greater capacity around cultural competence, we want to have a parallel process where we're making sure our hiring practices are racially just and inclusive, and that we really are analyzing those so that we have a third to a half of our candidates are folks of color who have the competencies, and every white person we allow into the process has the demonstrated competencies we're looking for around multicultural issues and race as well. Let me slow down. In the past, and what currently on all campuses, organizations I get to work with, they're focused on hiring more people of color, but they're not focused on the competency development of everyone. It has to be both. And then your hiring processes have to not let anyone in. No white person can get in if they're not culturally competent. I don't care who they know. I don't care what school they went to, which are all the ways whites get privileged into those organizations. And then you have to make sure, I'm kind of going into several things. You asked how to phrase it. We're working on cultural competence of everyone, and that our hiring practices are redesigned so that we attract and we can support candidates of color, and that we're changing our organization so even if we hire folks of color, they succeed here. And it's not their competence, it's our ability to have a climate and a culture that's not based on white racist, white cultural ways. So I know there was a lot in that minute or two, but to say we're working on two things, increasing our cultural competence, and the data shows, this is an important piece. I love using data when it really helps. The data shows that our clients have better results when they work with people who match their identities. And so we do not have enough racial diversity among our service providers, and we need more racial diversity in our leadership so our policies and our practices have a better chance of truly serving our increasingly diverse folks we serve. Hope that was useful.
All right, so the next one. What do you do when the person you're working with who is perpetuating the racist dynamics is a person of color?
So it's a much longer conversation that I would only want to have with whites after I believe they have demonstrated clear capacity to recognize and interrupt racist dynamics in other whites in the organization. Many whites that I work with start there. Yeah, but people of color say this too. Yeah, but I got a person of color and they're the one that are doing those behaviors. My guess is if we look at it with an intersectionality lens, and for folks that's a jargon word, sorry, I should have introduced it earlier. It means that there's multiple identities happening. It could be that they're coming out of male privilege. It could be they're coming out of hierarchical class privilege. It could be they're coming out of class of origin privilege. And so while as a white person, early in my analysis, I might say, see, people of color doing it too. Yeah, they're a person of color, but what's fueling their inappropriate behavior more likely is coming out of privilege. Now, that being said, Dr. Tanya Williams, who I'm hoping might do some webinars in my process, her work and great in campuses and other organizations, she works in nonprofits as well as a consultant, on internalized racism. Everybody in every marginalized group has the capacity. I did as a lesbian, I internalized all the horrible negative messages, the stereotypes about lesbians and gays, bisexuals. Today we would include transgenders. We're seeing the connections across gender identity and sexuality and how we think about it. So I absorbed all those, so I needed to heal. So I might have been the one in the room telling a homophobic joke. So if that's what you're talking about, that's different than what I was talking about earlier, maybe. So having space, every organization I think needs employee employee affinity groups by race, and having enough so that if people say, you know, I want to have one for multiracial, biracial for sure, or someone might say, I want an indigenous space because the people of color space, actually, I don't get indigenous, and that's about colonization, right? So enough spaces while you're having white space. And in those spaces, just because you're a person of color doesn't mean you understand racism or white supremacy. Better chances, but doesn't mean. And so it might be useful to also do some of these activities and Dr. Tanya Williams' work around internalized racism, how many people of color have come to believe the same racist, the common racist and attitudes of whites, that handout, pages 4 to 6. Folks of color who come to my workshops working with whites, I'll be at national conferences and a third will be people of color. I was just somewhere they were half. Invited them to also take this, thinking about themselves, given internalized racism. And many people shared and said, I've been taught to believe this and I'm still acting out of it. It's different. I don't have enough time to go into it, but that's from the marginalized, internalized, deserve healing space. One more point. If you're investing in whites in any way, if there's any money or resources or work time, there needs to be at least parallel offering to folks of color for the same. And so if you invite a consultant in to do work with whites, how are you bringing consultants to work with folks of color? And if you are a consultant or you're invited in to work with whites, please do not accept until you say, tell me how you're supporting very similar ways with folks of color. And I would only say yes if they're doing, and if they say we're not, then as I've done, offer, well, I've got some great ideas and people we can actually do parallel days. And so, you have time for a few more?
I do.
Oh, yay.
Some folks do not want to be educated. How do you deal with them?
Start with relating in. Remember the pairs? Start with the R. And remember when you were just like them. I actually I was in my doctorate program. They had a whole weekend on racism. And I think I was just ducking the whole time, trying to just get through it to say I did it. I was not teachable. I would love to see what that workshop really was back 30 whatever years ago. 25, 30, however long, 20, sorry, just had a little moment. And I'd love to see what I missed out on. And if I had really been, so when were you just like the people you're judging? So that you come out of compassion and accountability. Please don't ever hear me say compassion and stop there. It's compassion and accountability. I want change and I want accelerated change, but I don't believe we get it by meeting people that way. Most people, and that's just not how I do it. And then I would go to the S on pairs and I would tell some stories. I'd say, you know, I would love to have lunch and talk to you about what I'm learning and get your opinion about what could change in this organization. And you might start there. If you have a position of leadership, you can bring all of this into your team and do it across race. And if they're a peer and you care about them, you can say, I care about you and I'm working to support this organization to be about racial justice. And I would love to support you deepening your capacity and see if that works. And if it doesn't, you can maybe say, I could be wrong, but I think this organization is moving towards training everybody in these areas, holding us accountable, and will eventually let people go if we don't do our own work as whites and if we don't show up as active change agents. I'd love to support you and others in this because, to be honest, I care about you and I've seen some of your behaviors that remind me of me, and I also need to apologize. I haven't talked to you about them. So I've not shown up as a good friend, but I'm trying to now. And I hope you don't like block me out, but I really learned from you in many ways, but this is one area that I want to support you in. It's the best I got today.
All right.
And then, by the way, work with your organizations to make all those systemic changes come true. What you got?
What would you recommend for colleagues working with other white people who've consistently been given feedback on unproductive behaviors and choices to only address them when they're called out / called in? And at what point does this person need to hear it's time to go?
Yeah. I bring that up to many places I consult, top leaders. I'll say 18 months, 24 tops, and I think that's probably too long, of this culture change, but tell people all along, we expect you to be at this level. If you're not, then we're going to have a conversation about whether this is the place for you. I've had one leader when I've said, are you willing to do that? Because then I'll work with you. If not, I'll give you somebody else. And she said, yes. This is so hard for folks. So the work might have to be even deeper to say, do you even do performance management in general, much less around racial justice? And start the work there. Embed these competencies into performance management, into hiring, so that people know this is what we're doing. It's got to be, supervisors have to be trained how to be coaches and mentors and support and educate people how to do performance management. Most I run into don't know how. And so working with HR in your organization to really do significant training changes so that supervisors, team leaders, project leaders get skilled how to give feedback, how to give ongoing coaching. But to do that, they have to have the competencies themselves. So this is not always easy to do, and it's not a quick fix, but it's long-term culture change. When I work with folks, I like to ask, so what would someone have to do to be confronted? And what would someone have to do after being confronted 3-4 times to be told it's time to go? So ask those questions. Mostly it's about people finding the courage and the leaders. God, I could keep talking. If I just put on a higher ed, there are so many people kept as faculty and leaders. They're given the, what's it called? The golden, I don't know what they're called. Anyway, they need to have been fired, but they weren't. And some of that is union protection through tenure protection. So there's a lot of dynamics, but some of it is you're my buddy, or I know this one organization, somebody needed to go a long time ago, but they've been there the longest in senior leadership and they know where all the bodies are. So there's many other dynamics on why people do not step up and work for social justice. So it's a long answer that I'm not going to get into, but mostly the skill development of people, but asking your leaders to get clear. What behaviors do we expect? What behaviors we will not tolerate? Have the entire organization. I do something where I have people in groups. This is how I get people to kind of talk about what are our community principles. Small groups, take a piece of paper down the middle. Left side is what behaviors promote collegiality, productivity, and really help us build community and be of service. You know, whatever you want to call it, whatever your values are, right? Your outcomes. Down the middle, on the next side, put what behaviors cross a line. I did this with 300 people this fall. Have them talk, chart, discuss, and then do a stations activity. They move to like 10 different, well, I exaggerate, 5 different places. But I want them to see 5 or 6 so they realize what else people have said. So they kind of get a gestalt, kind of like a big picture. And then I have in the past, you can get a group, a cross-section of the organization to take all that data, synthesize it, get it into a page or 2, and then send it out the entire community. And or in the meantime, you can send out those questions to people, and anybody in the organization can add, because not everybody got to be there. This was like a 20,000 organization. Maybe it was like 4,000 leaders and staff and faculty. So get people to identify them, get clear what behaviors we will not tolerate, and then ask the question, what will you do if? And what will you do if this is the 5th time? And how are we supporting people impacted by those? ask the hard questions. Sometimes you can't do this alone. You might need some outside help. Get HR involved if HR is there to create change and not just support the status quo. I'm having fun. Do you still have time?
I do.
Let's go.
How can we make an impact at an organizational level if we're not in a leadership role?
Find out what your leaders care about. Is it reputation? Is it finances? Is it truly strategic goals? And what are those? And then how can you get real live data that helps show the gap? So if they care about reputation, having some data about satisfaction from employees and clients that's disaggregated, that means broken out by race. So what do whites say compared to, and make sure you really disaggregate. So what do Latinx, Latinos, right? What do Asian American, Pacific Islander, Desi? What do Native American, Indigenous? What do Arab, Middle Eastern, African American, Black, multiracial, biracial, white, right? Break it out. If you have a large enough organization to break it out by race and level, might be interesting, race and department, but you have to really make sure you have lots of folks of color, Indigenous folk. And I do a few focus groups to ask folks of color if they want it broken out by unit yet. You may not be far enough along in your organizational change process to be safe. It may be dangerous. So get some data. If they're concerned about serving clients, that data to show the difference will be very important. Have some conversation with that data. Now, you may be so far down, quote, the organization, but you might go talk to a couple leaders. Talk to somebody that you think could be heard by the leader. Who are they get coaching from? Who do they listen to? Can be ways to get this. The national climate, especially in higher ed, is one that most senior leaders where I get invited in care enough that they don't have a protest and they don't get in the paper. So even if we're at that very bottom level of, there are some dynamics that are happening in our organization that I believe we need to address, because I think we're close to having people feeling there's no other action for change besides getting in the paper, national news, and that will hurt our reputation. That will hurt our applications for faculty, staff, and students. So again, whatever is the angle in for the leaders, and you may not know. So it might be getting a bunch of people together to start talking about the current climate and looking at data yourselves, who will come, do some trainings to get people aware enough to be able to talk about what's going on and to have examples, microaggressions, macroaggressions, and then strategize, how do we get senior leaders involved? Again, in April, I'll be doing some work on that, but this is, 7 to 12 years, my mentors would tell me it takes to do culture change. But there are some ways to get leaders, some to most leaders, concerned. But some people are in states with legislatures who appoint regents. I was just talking to somebody the other day about something around racism, and they're like, if we call a program interrupting racism on our campus, our regents won't settle for that. So there's just many layers that I'm still learning about. And leaders are just one of the pieces there. Legislators is one, governors. I never realized how much they impact higher ed. Some of y'all are laughing at me because you're like, did you get a master's in student affairs? I did. We weren't taught, or at least I was still drinking. I wasn't paying attention. All right, what you got?
Oh, I love your honesty. And we're getting a lot of that, by the way, in the comments and the chats here about your honesty. So thank you. And just so everybody knows, because I've been doing the question answering, I haven't answered every single comment in the chat, but we will go back through and read them all later. So please don't feel ignored. All right, next question. What can you do if you are asked by your boss to create a more inclusive environment in your workplace? And while your boss is supportive, they just don't fully buy in and don't model the behaviors consistent with the environment that you're trying to create?
So I would say, of course, April will be talking about this program, Inclusion Practitioners, to get people trained and embedded and with the responsibility to work with the leader to create change. You're short of that, but first thing I might say, I would love to do that. can we talk about how to have that a part of my role and responsibility so we work together and partner? So I learn from you, maybe you learn from me, and we're strategically thinking, maybe bringing in a diversity council here in the unit so that we really are doing culture change collaboratively. And I wouldn't settle for less than a 10 to 15, 20% part of your job if you can get it, and not add it on, but something else goes someplace else. So this is on your resume. I mean, it's on your position description, right? It's the negotiation with a leader that's critical. And I have to be honest, I didn't do that when I was in higher ed, and even when I started consulting for years. Today, I am better at negotiating with top leaders before I even say yes to come on campus. So your internal, I had questions like, tell me your motivation. How come this is important to you? I'd get to know a person, and just relate in. And then say, tell me more about you. You're my boss, but we really haven't talked. So tell me more about your group identities and where some of your passion is for wanting greater inclusion. And they may look at you sideways, but that's all right. You're inviting them into the conversation, and they may find more than you think is there. And they may find more than they know is there. And then I'd say, you having the passion for this will be critical, because how you talk about it, and then as soon as you say we're doing this, people are going to be watching you like a hawk. You're going to be under a microscope, and so your behaviors are going to be watched to say, is this just you're talking it or you walking the talk? And so if you want my support, we can be working together to find, because I know I'm still doing things that are undermining what I say is important. And so our coaching relationship could be important. Boss may not like that word coaching, but as we work together, I might be a confidential safe space that we can talk about how we each are showing up in ways that's advancing your commitment to equity, inclusion. And notice I said I wouldn't say that to them, but I'm doing it to you all. Keep it on them. So they're saying you do it, but keep saying it's there. So yep, let's do it together. Ask them where they see, what's their vision? What is an ideal inclusive organization? What would it look like? And, use their learning style. So if they're a drawer, say, just kind of draw me a couple images, or tell me a story of the closest thing you were ever in, or imagine what would be happening. These are all things I do in workshops, and I teach people I work with my consulting group to do. And lots of people do this. So, and then say, so you said this is why you wanted to do it. Can you say a little bit more about the gap between, here's your vision, where do you see us now? What's the current state? And then have a bunch of questions there. You follow what they say, but if they're talking only about gender dynamics and only kind of cis male, female, and say, well, what do you notice about gender identity? And where do you think we are? Like a scale to 1 to 10. 1 is unaware, actively perpetuating oppression. 5 is not very aware, kind of passively. And 10 is active social justice change. Where do you think we are on classism, hierarchy, as well as class and current class? Where do you think we are in disability status? So I'm making a note to how to work. I think this could be a webinar in and of itself, or maybe it's 2 or 3. 2 or 3 questions like this. And I might bring some other people on just to get some other ideas. So all that I just offered is trying to get them to find buy-in and to model differently, because you said people are going to be watching you. And there's a lot more, but that might be some place to start. And then say, I'm willing to do this with you in partnership. And I don't know what that looks like yet, but we have to keep talking. I'm thinking at least every 2 weeks. If not, I can just stop in, even, every week just for a little bit to tell you and ask you questions. But for this place to really change, it's going to mean leadership has got to change. I got to change, and everybody else has to change. And you may not even know what that's going to mean. But for now, does that sound like what you're really asking? All right. How about a few more if you got time?
Yeah. So how do you advise folks in ways to recognize and understand white culture, to see themselves in participating in white culture?
Best idea today, I'd have them pre-read that Tema Okun article. You might get online, and if you find them, please send them to me. I've looked and I can't, but I didn't look for hours. Other work, because the term white supremacy culture, which is what that article is, could be a bum for people. Uh, but when you get into it, well, I like to meet people where they are and still use the title white supremacy culture. When you get into it, I think they'll read it and they'll go, oh. So I'd read it with some pre-work, like what looks familiar to our culture or any other place you've worked. What is the benefit and the potential drawback? I was moving fast. I meant to say that there are some aspects of white culture in some moments that are useful. So attention to time, attention to detail, getting things done quickly. There are times that's very useful. But if white cultural practices are the only way and the right way, and people are punished if you're different or not even invited in, that's where it's a problem. So that's why asking people, what's the benefit? If we have a sense of urgency, when is that beneficial? And when is it a potential barrier undermining our goals, undermining teamwork? Valuing the written word. When is that beneficial? When does that potential barrier or doesn't go far enough? I like that. I'm writing it down because that's why I love doing these things, especially this free stuff. It's like new thoughts come in, my guides. What we're trying to do is meet people where they are and nudge them just enough so they don't shut down, but they're willing to go. And then you come back together and you talk about it. So the anecdotes will help them see alternative ways, other ways. And they're like, huh. So another question would be, read the anecdotes, and when do you see those already? That's kind of an appreciative inquiry, positive psychology maybe. When are we already doing it, and when could be useful? Come together, maybe do 2 at a time, 3 at a time. Now, if you have a leadership position, you can say, we're going to do this in our staff meetings, our faculty meetings, our teacher meetings, and just maybe do 2 at a time. There were 13. So over, what's that, 6 weeks? You do them all. It's the regular attention to things, not just a one and done, which is dominant culture. Check it off, we're done. We'll get people thinking. And then as we're talking about it, you can say, what in our conversation or how we do work could be the anecdote or something else that might be better or more productive. That language is useful, productive, profitable, whatever your values are, because we have people from corporations listening. So profit is critical. To be honest, profit is critical for any K-12 school and college. We just don't talk about it, our bottom line. But if we're not serving students, if we have a lot of retention, then we're not able to do our job. And then you notice some universities are closing. That's what I would do. Just gently bring it in with those questions and have people talk, what could we do? And then you model new ways. Next meeting, be like, last week we talked about how we value the written word, research, theory, and I want to still have that knowledge, but we want to bring in more stories. So for this next decision, I want you each to go out and I want you talking to 5 people you usually don't talk about and ask them, what questions could we ask them that would help us make a better decision? So you're creating a new process together. And you try to do that for each of these, and then you just keep going. And you might even get a small group of folks to say, if anybody's excited about how we could change to only have white culture as the predominant culture, but to have white culture interspersed with other ways of being, maybe, I'd love to be meeting every couple of weeks with a group that will help me think about, as the leader, what I could be doing differently. So you get a small group of committed folk, maybe 4 or 5 meetings. Take them to lunch, see what happens. What else you got?
What degree or certificate would teach me how to teach others about diversity and inclusion?
One could Google, it's probably not an undergraduate, but I could be wrong. I would think it's a graduate level, so master's level or a doctorate level. And it may not be a full degree like Amherst, University of Massachusetts Amherst, but it might be cultural competence. It might be in a social work. I just don't know enough about the academic. I'm more of a practitioner. If people know them and you're listening to this, if you want to email me, I'll be glad to start collecting places so that I can answer this question better next time. And if we get enough, we may send it out to the folks that signed up for the webinar. I know I'm starting a master facilitator course probably this fall, some of my webinars, and then the virtual institutes, because that's my process: webinar, virtual institute, and occasionally I'll do it in person. To be honest, if you want in your organization to help me do in-person work, I'll give you some cut deal for a number of people from your organization, and we can do in-person work at your organization. But there are other folks. If you just look into your community, you might even Google who's teaching. What are the diversity firms in your area? You can put in the word social justice, because I'm talking about social justice, the work. It's not diversity. And see, they might have some train the trainer. I know I've done them in organizations for over 30 years. I know other colleagues that do them, but they're organization specific. You may want to go to conferences like NCORE, National Conference on Race and Ethnicity. White Privilege, people like Dr. Diane Goodman there does full day institutes and 3-hour pieces on facilitation skills. I'm doing all day on navigating difficult situations, which is a component that you need to be a trainer facilitator. And there are many other folks. The two people, me and Diane, are both white. There are other folks of color. I know Dr. Jamie Washington does train the trainer work. But you clearly have hit an area that I was going to write a 4th book this fall on effective facilitation, and I realized I wanted to build this way of getting these resources out to people more. But within a year, I'll have something, maybe even less than a year. What else you got?
Just as a mention here, apparently Goddard College has a program, and University of Toledo as well. Just people answering your question, your inquiry.
Yeah, Iowa State may still have a social justice minor. Oregon State, I think Dr. Larry Roper is there, and I know his work is, but to have a real certificate. So I'd love more information if people have it.
Great. All right. I lead an anti-racism group in my almost all-white church. The 3 Black male members have started attending. The dynamics you mentioned about people walking on eggshells and making awkward, quote-unquote, compliments about their clothing, singing voice, etc., have surfaced. How should I handle this? I'd like to address it at the group level, but I don't want to put the Black members on the spot.
So I'm extroverting because I've never experienced this, but you can tell I have opinions on most everything. I might ask, the one I'm closer to, and say, here's what I'm noticing. My guess is you're really impacted by what's going on. I'm wondering, would it be useful for, the 3 folks, African Americans, who are attending, maybe sit with me or to think about what I could do differently or what you want that space to be? Because I created it for an all-white space. I love that you're there, and I'm really aware of the racist impact that is happening. And I wanted to collaborate and just talk about it. I might start there and follow their lead. Some things that may come out of that conversation are naming, which might be you as the white person naming. I'm noticing I'm feeling more uncomfortable as we've come together, because as people are sharing what they're saying, I'm worried how it's impacting. And I'd use first names, Joe, Dewan, and Jules. And I just don't know. And what they'll probably say is, well, when we talked with you, we're like, this is not stuff that's new to us. We've heard this before, but I appreciate you raising it. So let's talk about how you white people are feeling with us attending. Are you all walking on eggshells? Are you, and how can we recreate our group norms and talk about how do we talk about racial prejudice and the racist dynamics in the church, and also understand there could be an impact and space for impact real time. If I, as a white person, say something and Jules, you're like, can we slow down? Or another white person might say, that had an impact on me as a white person. I'd like to talk about it. I'm wondering how it's impacting also our colleagues of color. Those are relatively advanced capacities, particularly for a mixed race group. It's potentially possible in organizations at the team level. And I'd be excited to, you can send me an email. I'd love to hear what you do. Help me get smarter. I don't do work in churches, so I'd love to know how I can recommend useful strategies. One quick one might be, if your pastors and deacons aren't in these conversations, how do you get them in these conversations? Because you're probably able to work at the individual, maybe group level, but if your leadership, and I think I had the right words, pastor, deacon, but I could be wrong. If they're not in the conversations, what scriptures they use, how they use them, what stories they tell, how they show up in this national, international context as we're having this attack on immigration and DACA students and other racist dynamics. So you could be asking them how they're using their power and privilege, leadership, hierarchy, as well as white privilege, to also dismantle racism and empower the whole congregation to be a part of helping the whole community create racial justice at the community level. Ooh, wouldn't that be exciting? Ooh, ask your pastors and deacons to invite other churches into that same conversations. What are we doing in the community to create racial justice? What else you got?
Love it. Actually, this is a question specifically about your process. When you go to an organization, do you speak with both the white people and people of color separately and or together? Basically, what's that process look like? There is so much that people of color want to say, but may not in front of their white peers, and vice versa. So there's kind of, yeah.
So the first time I was awake enough to realize that people were asking me to come do white ally work, they were like, we need work. We're senior leaders. We need white work. And I was awake enough to ask, what are you doing with the senior leaders of color? And they kind of looked at me. And I said, so I'll come if. And so I asked one of my colleagues of color if they would consider putting something together with me. And so what we designed was, I think we started out 2 days, so one day separate, where we each did racial work. And I don't know all exactly that happens in people of color caucuses. I believe it's everything from a chance to talk about the common racist dynamics you experience, the embedded racist policies and practices, and internalized racism. And intra-group work, because as you may know, as I named in your organization, there might just be 2 or 3 different racialized groups that experience racism. You might represent in the US here all the different groups that experience, in addition to people that might call themselves international, or we call them people of color. So having space to then, what we might say that feels a bump, a trigger, how can we more collaborate and not fight among? Because that's what the system of white supremacy does. It sets it up for people of color in different racialized groups, and within a racialized group, to fight among yourselves for the little bit of access we give to keep white supremacy in place. So to be able to talk about that and not do that horizontal hostility, how's that for jargon? Learned that in the University of Massachusetts Amherst readings. We then came back together for a half day to share what we learned and have a community cross-race conversation about the current state and what they wanted to do differently in that organization. As I look back, that was not enough, but we were external and resources were not as available for more work. I believe they did hire my colleague of color to come in and work much more with students, the folks of color, to continue in their growth and development. I wish they had continued their own work. It didn't have to be with me. There are people I can recommend that do this work. I don't have to be me. In fact, I got plenty of work. But to look at the organizational level that we talked about in this webinar. I don't know if that organization did that. Went to a different organization with a different colleague of color. We started off together and did some race awareness work because this group was not as far along, they said. And it was true, they were not. And then we did some race caucus work in the afternoon and then came back to share. Again, that group, it was happened to be a diversity council, maybe 40 people. That group could have used a 4 or 5 day retreat just on race, in my opinion, given where they were located in the country and the state dynamics. And we were able to do a day. So if you were doing this on your own, you're bringing people in, separate work, and then I'd ask the folks of color for sure. their opinion before you decide. Let's bring us together. There are a couple campuses that do racial Aikido, AIKIDO. I think University of Vermont, Oregon State are the two I know for sure. And what it is colleagues of students of color, and I think they have 100 students, so more monoracial. I'm assuming multiracial can attend, but then I believe there's one for multiracial, biracial, because you know that often we just think about monoracial folks of color and not. And then I got to work with some staff and faculty to develop one for whites. And what they did was they worked with the colleagues of color who were doing the racial Aikido weekends as colleagues and actually as advisors. So I actually raised my hand. They were kind of an advisory group to help them think through curriculum, not teach them. So it's the middle road. So instead of like, we'll do it ourselves, we know best, it's kind of white supremacy. Teach us, we don't know. To the middle road of, this is what we're thinking of doing. We're thinking to be helpful. What do you think? We would love your input, but we also know that's asking a lot. Is there a way you might want to be involved as we're in our process of developing? Because we'd like accountability. We're accountable to each other. We've hired a white consultant for accountability. And if you would like to be accountability, colleagues, advisory. So you notice my voice even changed my body because you're asking. And then you figure out a way that you can also share back so that all that time and energy and just intellectual capital is shared back and they're not just given away, teaching us again. So those are some ways to think about having multiple experiences. I think I addressed the question.
I think so.
Okay.
All right. Do you want to do one more? Keep going. How are you feeling?
I could do a few more.
Okay. Because we still have 12 open questions here. So we may just answer some of these in an email.
I think it's a great idea, but I will,
Okay.
If there's only 12 left, I commit to answering them all. And answering is not the right word, giving my thoughts in the moment.
Got it.
There are books written about this, and I encourage y'all to read them, particularly across racialized groups. Make sure you have lots of different voices in it as you're reading and learning.
All right. How do we re-engage white male leaders who leave sessions because they feel offended for a moment?
Yeah. So it can start with building the learning community. And so when I'm doing workshops, I'll probably start with, get up and go greet 5 or 6 people you don't know. I learned that again from Jamie Washington. You can tell I learned a lot from Reverend Dr. Jamie Washington. And then I have them find a high five buddy or a partner. And I might have them talk about, what's your passion for creating in this environment and policies that really serve everybody, including folks of color. That's early awareness. If I think they can handle the language of, creating a racially just organization, really creating policies that truly serve folks of color as we're also serving whites. What's your passion for that? Have them get the passion. So people might say, why are you wasting time doing all these diets? Just get to talk about racism. Because if you don't till the soil, water just runs off. And we want the water to seep in because that's where the nourishing and the growth will come. Again, new metaphor. I'm sure other people have used it, but it was new for me. I might have them early on talk about a time you saw a race dynamic and you spoke up effectively. Talk about some of the race dynamics you noticed in your community growing up, maybe some socialization work. So I would do all that because there are going to be a lot of white male leaders that have not had the opportunity to develop this competence. And you can call it coddling. I call it meeting people where they are and being effective and getting results. Somewhere in there, I have to remember to do learning guidelines, and that's where I'm moving towards. But I don't start with learning guidelines. I show them how we're going to have a collective learning community. I let them experience that it's not gotcha. I'm not calling them racist, and I'm not going to call people out. I don't do that. I tell lots of stories. Can you tell? And so if somebody does something, I'm like, actually, I thought that the other day. Here's what happened to me. So I'm engaging, people might call it calling in, but instead of just going, did you notice what you said? That's going to have a race impact. Now, I've done that occasionally. I was in a workshop where, and I wrote about this in the book, but I'm not racist. I meant to do a visual, if you can see it, where someone, mixed race group, faculty, academic leaders at a college, university, and white guy, and he said, I'm colorblind. And he's probably 45, 50 years old. Well, I felt the ripple in the room, and So I chose to engage it in a way that I think, and he did not leave the room. So how do you have people not leave, quote, so that they're offended? You train in such a way that you meet people where they are and nudge them and hold them accountable. So learning guidelines. In my guidelines, we talk about triggers. I like 14 of them. You can email if you want some of this material. And so one of them it is notice and share if you feel triggered. And while you engage people as you're setting up learning guidelines, I'll be like, so what could you do if you feel triggered? And I have people brainstorm. Well, I can journal. I can go to the bathroom and just kind of pause. I can name it in the room. I can maybe make some notes. And if I'm doing a work just on race with whites, I might say, or even a cross race, and I'm there with a person of color, as the white person, I might say, and as a white person, I actually didn't even attend a lot of the workshops on racism that were offered because I didn't want to be called out. So I applaud you for being here. And if you're scared you're going to be called out as racist, that's not how we do the work. And you still might notice in yourself some racist attitudes like I still struggle over. You may notice some of your racist behaviors like I still do. And you may disagree with some of the stuff we offer. Oh, well, when you're in meetings with your president and you feel a little triggered, can you get up and leave? So if you feel triggered in this workshop, I really encourage you to breathe, stay present. If you need to make some notes or you need to just kind of meditate for a moment, all right, but don't go too far because there's so much here that I wish I had had 20, 30 years ago, 40 years ago. So I hope you hang in there because your clients need us as whites to do better, and your colleagues of color who are doing our work for us need us to do better. So that's my hope for you. All right. I've never said that. I kind of like it, especially if I'm in a group that I think could leave. Another quick pre-work is I never do a piece of work, I think, without talking to leaders about their role. And it's like, and so now this could be top leaders I get to talk to. You might be talking about middle managers. But I might ask them to say, and I'd like you to talk to all your people. And if we're going to do this work, they need to stay in the room. And if they're feeling bumped by something, I hope they'll say it, because it could be something I say is offensive. And so if a white person is like, that didn't feel right, that's how we learn. It's the authentic engagement we need. So invite the leaders to then show up as well as to tell other people to show up. But racism runs so deep in people, and today in this national environment, most organizations and people I see, people are taking the full open door that's been given to them to just step out and say blatant, horrific, racist things that they've been thinking and doing behind closed doors, but before they may have never said in front of another white person who's at least trying to do diversity work. And in workshops and in meetings, I'm just hearing people are showing up in ways in our organizations. The hate crimes are increasing. So in our cities, so it's a different culture and climate we're in. And so in some ways, expect that we'll hear stuff. And you might even say, we want people to be respectful and honest at the same time. And so people may say things that bump you. So let's talk about when they do, whether you're white or a person of color. That's what we're here to talk about, and try to learn how to create an environment where we can work effectively together and unlearn some of the ways that get in the way of seeing each other as full, deserving human beings of respect and competence. And we got a lot of unlearning to do. What else you got?
All right, next one. When I noticed a racist action / microaggression, but I'm not directly part of the interaction, how would you advise interrupting the behavior? Example, overhearing a conversation where a white male interrupted and gave an answer that a woman of color had already started answering.
Yeah, so common. So it sounds like you were near enough by. So I'll do it two different ways. One is where you're not in the conversation. You just literally are walking by. You're like, oh, excuse me, I apologize, but what you were talking about, Angela, so direct to the woman of color, I overheard what you started to say, and is it all right if I just ask you to finish your thought? Because it would be something to be helpful to me. So that's one way. Ignore the white guy, just come in. But while you're listening to Angela, just glance at the white guy They said white man, right? Okay. Just kind of glance to say you're included, but keep most of your attention on Angela. And then have a conversation with Angela. Now, I believe in leaving no one behind. And so at some point I might say, and that really relates to what John was saying. So John, you were probably adding on to what Angela was saying when you kind of just jumped in, right? And so Angela, could you say more about? So I might just gently acknowledge that I saw John jumping in. I gave the benefit of the doubt that you were connecting. So that's what I do in the moment. If I was in the meeting, I might do the same thing. And it might just be, Angela, I'm curious, you didn't finish your thoughts. I would just love to hear more. And just use my white privilege to. So that's in the moment. But that's just at the kind of the group level. If you go up to kind of the cultural dynamics of that, actually down because my pyramid goes down to the organizational level, it might be that group needs to talk about the group norms and how we speak up and interrupt and why we do that. And John might say, that's my culture. I grew up in a family. That's how we did it. And ethnically, that's what we did. And then just talk about the impact. And how does coming from a white man interrupting, impacting people of color, how that's different from a junior employee who's been there 6 months interrupting a mid-level manager. Power, privilege matters. So have the conversation. And then I'd give John the assignment to watch 5 meetings like I talked about earlier. Who interrupts who by race? Who talks over whose ideas? And to try to help him get awareness. Good-hearted, well-intended white people across gender identity. But if you add male privilege and male arrogance to that, again, I don't know how much of that he internalizes because not all men get the same entitlement and arrogance. But if you have, like me, probably 20 privileged identities and 2 marginalized, then I have a lot of chances to act out of privileged behaviors. So those are several ways of doing it. Checking in with Angela afterwards and say, I wasn't sure what to do, but I saw it was happening. And my guess is that happens to you often, hearing Angela and then saying in those moments, are there other ways you'd want me to show up, whether you're there or not? Just ask. So supporting the people impacted, but also inviting feedback. Yeah. And then sharing these resources widely. Can you imagine if every team in your organization had to talk about the unproductive behaviors and how those impact? And then even the common racist dynamics. And that just was a part of how do we create a better, effective, engaged, productive team? And then say, now how these same dynamics happen from men to women, from cisgender to transgender, from people, quote, able-bodied to people with disabilities. The same thing from older to younger, experience. And have all that conversation. You got one more in you? You think we got to say goodbye?
No, let's do another one here.
All right, last one.
Hey, how can I find the interruptions? Oh, sorry. This person was wondering about the interruptions that you covered on intervening at the group and organizational level. Were those in the workbook that we shared?
The tool, so when I modeled maybe how to do it? What do you think?
It's a good question. We might have to go back and look at this one, and it might have to be included in our follow-up email.
Yeah. When people look at the packet, there's some tools there, but whoever this is, if you listen to this and you want to email me for what you want, you've got my email. I think I put that on the front. Yeah.
I've sent it out a few times and I can repost it in the chat too, if we need to. So
you go, Catherine Ferris. All right, let's do a real last one then.
Okay. Oh, let's see. I am new to my position building diversity and inclusion employee trainings on campus. I am currently conducting an informal needs assessment via a quote unquote listen and learn tour.
Yep.
Meeting with individuals / roles that currently do quote unquote diversity and inclusion work on campus. If you were trying to determine the grasp / needs for professional education / training in the D/I space, what is 1 or 2 questions that you would ask?
1 or 2? You're limiting me. Let me just step back a bit. So I love your talking to DEI folk. I would also talk to some middle managers, and I would talk to some folks of color at all levels of the organization. And here's some of the questions I'd ask. And I might even talk to some white people who don't do DEI work. So you might do a couple more listening sessions. Things like, I kind of brainstormed before, but things like, tell me a story of a time there was a race dynamic, either a disagreement or something across race and you saw there was a microaggression, the topic wasn't race or the topic was race and was not, and it was handled really well. So microaggression was interrupted, or so start positive or some productive. And if people look at you like, then that's data. And then tell me some, again, no names, but tell me some examples of what happens in this organization or what it feels like that shows how far we need to go. The first question was how far we've come. So those might even be two questions. How far have we come? Talk about what's working well, what's our progress around diversity, equity, inclusion. As a culture, how have we changed? How have we skilled people up? Not what workshops we've done, but what demonstrated changed capacity. We've got to move from activity to results. So what have you seen people do differently? No names, but what have you seen people do differently? And if you're doing full DEI, then I would say people in privileged identities. If that language doesn't work, then name it. You know, what have we seen supervisors and leaders do differently to create greater inclusion in the hierarchy? What have we seen whites do to create greater racial inclusion if justice doesn't work? What have we seen men do to create greater inclusion and support to dismantle kind of sexist dynamics, etc.? If you were in charge, what skills would you want everybody to do? What do you want them to know, do? How do you want people to feel? I have reflect on the current trainings, what was effective or not. I find many trainings are presentation kind of like this, and I don't think necessarily it's how people learn. And so actually analyze the DEI trainings to have them be case studies, self-awareness, self-work. Truly, the work that I do around diversity and equity inclusion in general, similar self-awareness, skill building, real time, how do you intervene in microaggressions, socialization. So again, if you want, I can share some of that. I'm thinking in June, I'll probably do a couple of these about how to do good foundational diversity equity training and share my resources. That's the questions I'd ask. Ooh, one more. What's the pain points? And change the language. But why should we do more? Why do our staff, faculty, students need more skills and create more inclusive organizations? So find out, part of it's the passion. So you could also ask that, but more, it's termed the business case. That's what organizations often call them. You can call it the leadership case, the organizational case, or just say why. What's our big why? That's getting popular. Simon Sinek, I believe, is talking about the why. So what's our why? Why is it important we do this? And all of that may get them more aware of what's needed, getting some examples and stories, and ask what's the impact of those? How does that undermine our goals? And then their why and what skills they want people to have. And also what's progress, how far we've come, how far we need to go. So on that note, there's still a handful of people on. I just want to say woohoo. Thank you all. Hope this was useful. I'm also getting the idea of maybe after each one of these, the month before the next one, just doing an open Q&A on the same topic, because over 1,000 people signed up and only close to 500 got on. So I was thinking this morning, Catherine, we might do that. So we'll talk in a moment about that new idea. But thank you all for the work you're doing. And I just wish you all the best. Go well.